Hey everybody, Master Sukuri coming to you from Tokyo, Japan. I am feeling fantastic today and I decided I wanted to get some things done. Today, I want to talk about a really interesting topic for all you capoeira enthusiasts. Today, I want to talk about the evolution of capoeira and how it's kind of had several phases over the last 400 or 500 years, since we don't really know the exact date. But I'm going to talk about the evolution of capoeira and hopefully add some interesting insights and things to keep in mind as it grows even more. So first, let's jump right into it. Capoeira really, it's undergone significant evolution throughout its history. It's constantly adapting and changing to each and every place it goes, as social, like how it is in that social context. Like I remember Mestre Vibes did an incredible interview video where he interviews his students. And one student said that, capoeira takes on a different form wherever it is. And Mestre Vibes also mentioned that a lot. And one of the students said capoeira is like fire, right? Like some people can hold it and some people can't. But 35 years later, I see that there's not only been an evolution during my lifetime, but also because I've seen the evolution of capoeira and how I've evolved. So I maybe talk about that a little bit at the end of the podcast today. But let's jump right into it. So I'm going to give you guys just some general topics. Capoeira, of course, everybody has very strong Afro-Brazilian roots. Now, we need to be careful when we say about Afro-Brazilian, because Afro-Brazilian doesn't mean one common root, right? It's not one common trait. So over the 200-300 years of the slave trade, at different points, there were different slaves that were brought, or different Africans that were brought to Brazil. 80% of all of the slave trade went through Bahia. So that's why we still always refer to it as the Black Rome, okay? Because of all the spiritual and how much the Africans that were brought over and how much they influenced Bahia and the rest of Brazil, not to mention most of the New World. Now, because of the different slave cycles, different aspects, like you could be from the same ethnic group, but you could have different cultural values. For example, we even have like the Husa, who came and they were the captured North African slaves who were very literate, very educated, and could read and write in Arabic, and that's another story. But we also had the Bantus and the Guinea and the Jeje, and we had all these different groups bringing in their cultural background, and at different times and in different locations. That's why we have so much variety, especially, for example, in the Afro-Brazilian cultural background. For example, especially in Candomblé, we have so much variety in the different houses, because maybe this house developed more during this African slave cycle with this influence. For example, it may be more similar to voodoo in Haiti, one of the houses, as opposed to the one next door. So we see a lot of mixing and cultural mixing, and this creates a lot of different types, even though the general idea is considered to be generally the same. So the evolution of capoeira can be traced through several key phases. First, its African roots. From the 16th century to the 19th century, capoeira originated in Brazil among enslaved Africans who were brought to the country during the transatlantic slave trade period. It had a lot of different influences from a lot of the different groups that came from Africa. It has the linguistic influence from Portuguese, because that's the language of the new home where a lot of the slaves were brought. But it's very African based. A lot of people will sometimes talk about the indigenous, like the Amerindian. Amerindian, for all those who don't know, is what's actually the technical word for people who are native to instead of Native American, we say, because that tends to be more for the United States, but we say Amerindian for people who are of the New World, who are there before the European contact. So the problem with that is most of the Amerindians either died from the diseases from the Old World, or they were able to escape into less developed areas and form their own, because they already formed their own villages and whatnot, because they already had knowledge of the land and of everything. So I would say yes, it by all means it could be, Native American or Amerindian influences in capoeira, but generally I would say 90% is Afro-Brazilian. Okay. It drew inspiration from traditional African dance, rituals, and martial arts, serving as a form of resistance and self-defense for the enslaved population. Like culture anywhere, in one area, it can develop in a different way than in another area. For example, in Bahia, it became a lot more ritualistic, almost. Yes, it was a martial art, and it did serve as a martial art in the form of self-defense, but it was highly acrobatic and highly ritualized with a strong aspect on dance. While, for example, in Rio, it's a little different. It tends to be more martial arts and stronger in that form from what the research I've done and to the old masters I've talked to. It's just like, if I want to draw a comparison between that, it's like hip-hop. In New York, because of the cultural context, hip-hop developed one way, while on the West Coast, it developed in really like gangster rap. And it's kind of like what happens with anything that's culturally developing and becomes popular. So although you might have an area where it has a different way of doing capoeira, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. So like the way Bahia does it, or the way that Rio de Janeiro does it, or the way that Pernambuco does it, although it's a little different maybe in the approach or the general understanding of the art, it is still at base capoeira and based on the Afro-Brazilian cultural and self-defense. So I remember once Mestre Kalunga, Mestre Kalunga, I'm talking about the one who lives in Boston, a good friend of mine, an amazing person to talk to about spirituality in candomblé. He's just so well educated, well informed in that topic, and I love talking to him about Afro-Brazilian cultural religious practices, and therefore, but that's for another one. He once told me a story about why it's called Meia Lua de Frente, and the reason is because the masters or whatnot, after the capoeira game or after people would practice capoeira, they would have like a half moon shape on their body. Like maybe if the person was found, with this bruise on their arm or on their leg or anywhere, and he said it's because the way the heel hits, it leaves kind of a little bit of a half moon, and that's where the term Meia Lua de Frente comes from. So I don't know if that's true, but it sounds pretty nice. So I thought I'd share that with you guys today. So maybe the Meia Lua de Frente comes from the bruise that's left from that kick. So then we move into the second time of capoeira where it became very suppressed, very oppressed, and the criminalization of capoeira. Right, the criminalization of capoeira. And that was from like the 19th century to the 20th century. And we see a lot, the laws that prohibit capoeira. We need to always keep in context of that at that time, Brazil now is huge, and not with internet. I mean, time took for things to get back and forth communication. So what might have been already illegal in one place might not have reached another place. So we do get that influence on the social and cultural and political aspects of capoeira. In the 19th century, capoeira became highly criminalized in Brazil. Authorities saw it as a threat to the social order and associated it with rebellion. If we look at the rebellions, for example, in Rio de Janeiro, especially in Bahia with the Malé rebellion, it was such a big shock to the status quo that anything that became that brought African slaves or Afro-Brazilians together was deemed illegal. So I want to be very clear. So many capoeiristas get romantic and say, oh, capoeira was criminalized. Guys, everything that brought any form, the batuques, the samba de roda, anything, candomblé, anything that brought slaves or ethnic groups or criollos, which is the people who were born and raised, like the second, third generation Africans in Brazil, that brought them together, was generally restricted and illegal. So it's not just capoeira, it's everything that brought people together. And we see that happening a lot, especially in the 19th century, all the way up until the 20th century. So if you did like batuques, anything was brought together. Now, it's interesting because at this point, just as a side note, I'll let you guys know that when we talk about an Afro-Brazilian identity, that's a new thing. Traditionally, there is no such thing in any part of the world where there's like a one identity. One of the main reasons that most of the rebellions failed, even though people say, well, how can they fail when 80% or 60% or 70% of the population is African descent? And the real reason is divide and conquer. Most of these groups did not cooperate with other groups or join in their movements. For example, criollos, the people who were born here, the Africans who were born and raised in Brazil, felt higher status. They felt like, they didn't want to mix or be a part of those kind of activities. And in the same way, when the criollos would commit a revolution or where they would do something to do a rebellion, they weren't joined by the Africans who were just there. Language, linguistic, and especially ethnic and linguistic connection is what led to a lot of what we call the hermanidades, which is the brotherhoods or the sisterhoods that were generally based on a connected and similar cultural, linguistic, and ethnic background, right? Like you had the Hermanidade dos Gegés or the Hermanidade dos Bantus. So you had all these different things, and they developed within Brazil in a very independent and basically a solitary movement. So that's just a side note to get you guys thinking about how Afro-Brazilian culture developed. It's only until we become later that this identity is going to be more important, why Afro-Brazilian identity becomes popular in Brazil, and it might, surprise you. So, practitioners faced persecution. We all know the story, right? If you get caught capoeira, they're going to drag you by the horse to the police station. So the joke was, if you're going to get arrested for capoeira, make sure it's close to the police station. So, and it forced capoeira to go underground, right? Like people, the whole nome de guerra or the apelido, the nickname of capoeira, so that you couldn't be traced. Just like in African American culture and Latino American culture in the United States, someone say, "Oh, who is that guy? I only know his name as macaco, or I only know his name as passarinho, or I only know his name as dendê de ouro or cordão de ouro." Like, it's a way to protect the identity of the people. And this happened so in case they were being sought after, they could say, "I don't know his real name," so you couldn't figure out who was doing what. I don't know how long that lasted, but it seems like that's kind of a universal reason for street names, right? And during this time, it developed as a more secretive and ritualistic nature to avoid detection. And we go back to the hermanidades and all those kind of things, and we realized that capoeira became very secret society. So like you had to know somebody who was doing capoeira to teach you capoeira, or somebody had to give you an introduction or vouch for you because of how risky it was to be doing capoeira and getting caught, right? You wouldn't want a student who's going to just betray you at the first sign of the police coming. So it had to be somebody who was going to have a connection with you. So that's generally always like, Mestre João Pequeno says Mestre Besouro de Magangá was the cousin of his father. I think that's what he had said in one of the interviews. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's his. So it's somebody that you knew who practiced the art. Then in the third phase of capoeira, we move into the generation of Mestre Bimba and the style of regional capoeira, right? And this is in the early to mid 20th century. Mestre Bimba, born in the early 20th century, at the turn of the century, he played a really pivotal role in the evolution of capoeira. He sought to legitimize the art by creating the regional style, luta baiana regional, luta regional baiana. And this was something he wanted to do because he wanted to teach it as a profession, right? The first person to think, I'm going to do this as a profession. Who knows if there was other people, but he's the first person credited with that movement. So Mestre Bimba decided to register with the Pugilistic Society, which is the boxing association of Bahia. And he did a lot to legitimize the art of capoeira that he was teaching. Mestre Bimba structured capoeira into a more recognizable martial art, right? It became a martial art, a fight. Luta regional baiana. Luta, fight, okay? Introducing a formalized system, a grading system, and the emphasis in its effectiveness in combat, right? So Mestre Bimba was a well-known vale todo fighter. He could fight with capoeira, getting rid of all the extra stuff, right? All the, what we would call the capoeira Angola ritualistic stuff. Not that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it helped to incorporate or bring into the fold socially capoeira for the first time. He taught more middle class and higher class, especially white people, and he had students that were able to represent capoeira in a more martial arts way, because things like judo and karate had already been well aware of in Brazil, and boxing. So to legitimize it, he had to kind of do away or water down the African Brazilian roots. And this helps with the way to bring capoeira into the light and into, not that it was in the darkness, but into the social arena more effectively. And one thing that's really important is that we have to remember that this is also at the time that we start to discover a Afro-Brazilian identity. And I'm in quotes, I say Afro-Brazilian because there's so many variations in it. And what happened was, at this time, the president of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas, was dealing with a lot of new migration from Europe. He was very focused on the branqueamento, or the whitening of Brazil, by bringing in Europeans. But when they opened up immigration, also a lot of Asians came in, so a lot of people. So it kind of backfired. And Getúlio Vargas decided, him and his staff decided to create a Brazilian identity. And what do the masses understand mostly is basically nothing became more powerful in African American community or in any ethnic community as to have a boxer or a fighter represent the lower classes or the masses, right? So Mestre Bimba, being a fighter, Mestre Getúlio Vargas started looking for things to call Brazilian culture. And at that time, the way Mestre Bimba was doing capoeira really helped in creating this Brazilian identity. It was not supposed to be Afro-Brazilian, but Brazilian identity. And that's why it was later removed from the penal code and capoeira was made legal. But the whole goal was to make it legal in a very white way, or branqueamento. Now, in contrast to Mestre Bimba, you had people such as Mestre Pastinha and the Angola style, which also, mid 20th century, because this was in response to Mestre Bimba's rise and popularity and development evolution of capoeira, especially luta baiana regional or luta regional baiana. So, around the same time as Mestre Bimba, Mestre Pastinha focused on preserving the traditional, ritualistic aspects of capoeira, leading to the development of the Angola style. And this takes me to another story that Mestre Calango once told me. Is like, capoeira back in the day, of course it wasn't like a in-your-face martial art. It was something that the slaves or the Afro-Brazilians or the lower classes played. Why? Because if you were to hit another slave, it's basically one piece of property damaging the other piece of property. So he tends to believe that capoeira generally in practice was more like almost like rugby or a more physical game or sport versus, an all-out fight against each other. So, but again, with anything, it can go up in level and it can become more intense. So Mestre Pastinha's concept of Capoeira Angola was that you could hit your friend, but it's not really like you're trying to kill each other, right? So Capoeira Angola emphasized the game-like, the non-competitive aspects, maintaining a connection to its historical and cultural roots. So we see a lot of ritual in capoeira. We see a lot of ritualistic aspects in Capoeira Angola, and then we still see that today. Sometimes I feel, in my opinion, that it gets over-ritualized and takes away a little bit of the freedom away because people are trying to be the owners of culture or the know-all, be-all in the art. So we need to be very careful and understand that capoeira is very free and very expressive. So it will take on different, but I do also agree you need to maintain a lot of the cultural understanding and the ritualistic aspects of capoeira. You can choose to play capoeira Angola, capoeira regional, and there's so many different styles. Remember, capoeira is regional, Angola, or any form, the epitome of liberation. So you can do the style you like. If it doesn't work in the roda, then it doesn't work. And then we move into the late 20th century to the present is the globalization and popularization. And I feel pretty confident talking about this in Japan because that was my master's degree. Globalization of Afro-Brazilian culture, especially in capoeira, Afro-Brazilian dance, and samba in Japan. That's what I did at Waseda. That was my master's degree thesis. So we get to the later half of the 20th century. Capoeira really experienced a resurgence in Brazil and gained international recognition. Now, I want to say something here that I think is very interesting. It's a lot like hip-hop. When I was growing up, hip-hop was still pretty new, so it was considered a dirty black thing, right? I mean, I'm saying that in the way that people thought about it. Not that I thought I loved hip-hop since I was a kid. And samba was the same way. It's a black person. Capoeira is a low-class black thing, right? And we see that once capoeira, just like hip-hop, became popular and practiced and enjoyed and culturally eaten by whites or non-Brazilians, then Brazilians tend to start thinking capoeira as a form of identity and something that they hold on to, right? So really interesting. When I was going to train capoeira when I was really young, and I remember there was a black older woman, Afro-Brazilian older woman, and she was like, why are you doing that una coisa de preto, right? It's really offensive, and it's like saying the N-word in English. And she said, why are you doing that? Like, what's the value in that? And I was like, wow. Because she had an area where she rented out one of like the halls in her little bit of land outside the city to a capoeira teacher. And she was black. So we see the cultural programming and the cultural lack of awareness, but that's just going to happen with everything. I never held it against her, but it shocked me, right? Like the globalization, I feel the popularization of capoeira in Brazil only really took off after non-Brazilians and foreigners decided that capoeira was cool. Once people started to go to Brazil and money was being spent looking for authenticity, looking for masteries, looking for all these different things, capoeira began to boom to where we have tours of capoeira. Groups take their students to Brazil for capoeira. There's so many things that are now part of capoeira as it grew globally. And it went out from Brazil in small points, but it came back with a fever, and it really increased the importance of capoeira in Brazil to where today it's a UNESCO art. Now, the incorporation of capoeira into popular culture is something we really need to think about. Capoeira has become a symbol of Brazilian identity and culture, often featured in movies, music, and cultural events. I mean, I don't think there's a capoeira person who's non-Brazilian who, when you talk about capoeira, every Brazilian goes, "Oh, I'm Brazilian. I know capoeira." It happens so much that it's like just because you're Brazilian, and that's a form of what I like to consider, I call positive racism, right? Positive labeling. You're because something's cool, automatically you're a part of it, but maybe in Brazil you weren't. Like one of the biggest things that I came across doing my thesis 10 years ago was that so few Nikkei, what we call the Brazilians of Japanese descent that came to Japan, had zero or very little contact with capoeira or samba, and most of them actually learned it here. There's a few exceptions, but most of them started their cultural identity in Afro-Brazilian arts in Japan because their family or the stigma or the reputation of capoeira was very different. So I think that's a very interesting aspect of capoeira and how it evolved. So its integration into popular culture has led to a broader acceptance and understanding of capoeira, both in Brazil and around the world. Outside of Brazil, I would say that it's become a form of cultural expression and what we call the third place, right? You have your home, your work, or your school and your home, and then your third place. Capoeira has become a third place, and it's very positive in that way as a form of psychological medicine, a psychological support, having that third place. And in Brazil, we see that a lot of people are now getting more involved, especially because it's a way to have a possible career, especially with the internet and, things where you can, if I can get 30,000 subscribers on my YouTube, which, I can't, or don't want to try, but if you can do that, you can do that. That's why, I see the incorporation of capoeira in popular culture also with technology evolving, right? You can learn. I know people who have learned almost nothing from their quote unquote masteries or masters and 99% from YouTube. And you can see that when they do things so. Good or bad, that's just the evolution of it, right? Today, we're talking, about these evolution of capoeira and how amazing it is. But at the same time, we need to think about what are the contemporary trends and styles, right? Today, capoeira continues to evolve with various styles and trends emerging. With each group getting bigger, I sometimes feel their styles become too rigid. There's only that way of doing. And sometimes the overtraining of sequencias or combinations of moves take away from the creativity and flow of movement. Some practitioners focus on the acrobatic and athletic aspects, and we see that in certain groups, while others emphasize the cultural and historic dimensions. And of course, there are all those groups that are like, we are a martial art. So you get all these different styles. Remember, at the end of the day, if you don't want to be in the roda, just extend your hand to shake it and get out. A lot of people feel like, I don't like playing with that group, or I don't like doing this because they're too aggressive. But the truth is, extend your hand. That's the main rule of capoeira. So don't panic in the roda. This leads us to really importance of, cross-disciplinary influence, such as the incorporation of elements from other martial arts and dance forms. a lot of this contributes to the ongoing evolution of capoeira. I see so many things on Instagram that derived from capoeira that I go, oh, this person obviously trained capoeira. But I think it's a good thing as we evolve and do. A really good friend of mine in New York was telling me, it was like, it's kind of like a house dance, partner dance of capoeira. I don't know if I can explain or what it's called, but it looked like they were doing capoeira, of course, with no kicks or anything, but a lot of the ground movements and a lot of the house movements. So we get the different styles emerging, right? Personally, overall, capoeira's evolution reflects its resilience. It reflects its adaptability and the ability to transcend its historical challenges, right? It's gone beyond being looked down upon by the world community, especially the world community of capoeira. As it continues to spread globally, practitioners contribute to the art's growth, ensuring its relevance in the modern world. And the last food for thought, like I'd mentioned earlier, that we see people who 99% get from YouTube. And this happened because of the lack of availability of capoeira in some parts of the world, but also because that's the way people learn now. I would say that I've been seeing a trend more and more in the last 10 years, especially of where people want to get more authentic or more mentorship or more in touch with capoeira. So, and let's say, back in the day, you learned 100% from your master. Now you learn 99% from master YouTube, right? So we're seeing some people who are more like, okay, I want to learn what's behind the meaning, what's behind the ritual, what's behind the cultural practices of capoeira. And this is just something that naturally happens with any art. It's going to happen, and it's continuing to happen. You can do capoeira that you want to. At the end of the day, the community accepts you, the community doesn't accept you, and you move forward. But capoeira is evolving. Guys, thank you for supporting so much. Lots of love, lots of peace, lots of capoeira. Mestre Sucuri, Mestre Vibes, Patreon. Thank you for supporting and being the great people that you are.